Špici, History on the Edge series. It's my pleasure to introduce our current fellow, Jelena Đureinović, today. Jelena is a researcher at the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna. Her research interests focus on memory politics and memory cultures of the 20th and 21st centuries. In her current project, she investigates Yugoslav socialist internationalism and the global history of Yugoslav remembrance culture. Recently, she published a book on the politics of memory of the Second World War in contemporary Serbia with Zgodovina. And today, she will focus on globalizing the Yugoslav revolution in the postcolonial world. So, Jelena, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maya. And thank you all for having me, both today for this talk and also as a visiting fellow this month or these few weeks. I will present some aspects of the broader research project that I'm working on, which has the same title as the talk today. To start with a little story, in May 1959, a Yugoslav ship carrying 26 wounded fighters of the Algerian National Liberation Front, or FLN, arrived to the port of Rijeka. This group of 26 men was a part of a larger group in need of medical rehabilitation and prosthesis, and they would spend the next few months in hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and orthopedic clinics across Yugoslavia. And one of the few people who were accompanying them from Tunisia or from Morocco to Yugoslavia was Desanka Perović from the nursing school of the Red Cross of Yugoslavia. Desanka was too young to have experienced the People's Liberation War during the Second World War herself, but she still identified with the suffering, difficulties, heroism, and sacrifice of the partisans through reading about it, she said. During the stay in Morocco, where they picked up the Algerian liberation fighters, she said that she saw the People's Liberation War as she imagined it there, admiring the Algerian people who, just like Yugoslavs, I quote her, stood up against colonialism for the bright cause of the future. Perović was also very impressed by how much Algerians seemed to know about the People's Liberation War in Yugoslavia. And this long trip from North Africa to Yugoslavia was followed by various expressions of friendship and solidarity and so on. For example, Perović describes it as there were not two nations on that ship, but only one. Then, for example, there were not enough beds on the ship, so the part of the Yugoslav naval crew gave up their beds and slept on the floor so that the wounded fighters could have beds. And one of the men in this group was a 19-year-old man called Ali, who could not contain his excitement about going to Yugoslavia. He said that this did not feel like going somewhere new, but that it felt like going home to his family. He said, I quote, and this is a quote that's here as well, your liberation struggle has been a model for us in our hardest times, what the fight should be, what sacrifices should be made, and what to go through for freedom. End of quote. By 1962, almost 300 FLN fighters would go through medical treatment and rehabilitation in Yugoslavia, after which they returned to Tunisia or later, after independence, to Algeria. And the care for the wounded fighters was a medical part of a medical dimension of the broader Yugoslav support for the FLN during the war, which was also financial, military, diplomatic, and humanitarian as well. And why I told this story, what it summarizes or illuminates is what I will talk about today. First, the agency and networks behind Yugoslav support for anti-colonial struggle. To explain it a little bit, the mentioned transport of the wounded fighters was managed by the Red Cross of Yugoslavia, but the Red Cross was doing it as a part of the Yugoslav Committee for Helping Algeria. And this committee had different state institutions involved, but also two socio-political organizations. the Alliance of Trade Unions of Yugoslavia, and SUBNOR, the Veteran Association. And in this context, the state institutions provided funding and necessary support, but it was these socio-political organizations that had direct contact with the FLN and that shaped also the Yugoslav assistance during the War of Independence. And these organizations, including SUBNOR, remained the main drivers of the Yugoslav initiatives of anti-colonial solidarity throughout the 60s and 70s. And here, in this context of these socio-political organizations, I focus on SUBNOR, and I also focus on veterans more broadly, and I will explain soon why. The second theme that surfaced during this already mentioned transport of the wounded fighters was the role of memory and legacies of the Second World War. And here, in the stories of the nurse or the young Algerian fighter, you have narratives of the similar struggle. But there was also important transfer of knowledge in treating the wounded and disabled soldiers, which was also in the case of Yugoslavia a crucial wartime and post-war experience of the partisans. And my broader project is very broadly about Yugoslav socialist internationalism and Yugoslav initiatives of anti-colonial solidarity. But here I'm interested in the role of memory and legacies of war, of the People's Liberation War. What does that mean more concretely? I currently, at the moment, focus on three aspects, and that's also the outline of the presentation today. First, the narratives of the common struggle for liberation. Second, we have the sharing of the Yugoslav experiences of the People's Liberation War and the post-war building of socialism in various post-colonial societies. And then finally, and I will briefly just mention that at the very end, we have also transfers of knowledge in war commemoration between Liberation War veterans from Yugoslavia and from these post-colonial states. And as I already said, here I focus on the partisans, war veterans or fighters, borci, and SUBNOR. And today I will be mostly talking about Algeria, and I think I mentioned that already last week. The reason for that is as I go through sources that I collected until now in the Yugoslav archives, I worked through them chronologically simply, so this is the reason why I'm talking about Algeria, but also Algeria represented in a way a pattern for the later help to anti-colonial liberation movements for Yugoslavia. And then for this later period, I look at the liberation movements of Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique to be also able to trace the changes and transformations of narratives, but also practices of Yugoslav assistance. Why veterans? I think that we can't really talk about the war legacies and memories in Yugoslavia without talking about the partisans, obviously, as both war participants, but also the main agents of Yugoslav culture of war remembrance. But also it is very hard to even think about socialist Yugoslavia without thinking about the partisans. And veterans agency, both in Yugoslavia and internationally, can be observed through the lens of first SUBNOR that I already mentioned as a socio-political organization, and also by looking at partisans as individual actors. I think in the context of decolonization, SUBNOR represents really a great example as one of socio-political organizations that simply could not act on their own in the context of decolonization because of both, of course, logistical or financial limitations. They couldn't provide help that they were asked to provide on their own. And this is the case with other socio-political organizations as well. And this is also the reason why so many initiatives of the Yugoslav assistance were a collective effort of various socio-political organizations, of course, with state support and with logistical participation of many different actors, including, for example, airlines, shipping companies, and other enterprises of Yugoslavia. And I would also argue, and for those of you who look at Yugoslav anti-colonial solidarity, this is very self-evident, but I argue, and I would really like to emphasize that socio-political organizations are very important lens for looking at the attempts of Yugoslav institutions and different actors to organize and manage anti-colonial solidarity throughout decades. So if we look at the beginning of the Algerian War, we have different organizations acting mostly individually, independently, having their own relations with the liberation movement, often sending parallel help of the same kind to the FLN and so on. And then there was this attempt of creating a committee for helping Algeria to, in a way, consolidate these efforts into one centralized thing. And then from the late 60s, socio-political organizations gather within the Socialist Alliance of Working People of Yugoslavia as a shared platform for helping liberation movements. And through these organizations, we can also, and these processes of organizing and centralizing help, we can trace the development of Yugoslav networks of solidarity between mid to late 50s and late 70s, and also this already mentioned transformation from very individual initiatives of socio-political organizations to establishment of some kind of coordinating bodies dedicated specifically to helping liberation movements. And of course, here also we have, in addition to the increasing institutionalization of these efforts, we also have more bureaucracy and more administration that comes with it, and this is also interesting. Of course, another level of international level of SUBNOR's activities is more broadly veterans internationalism after 1945, and but still SUBNOR, when it came to some concrete types of forms of help, SUBNOR could not do much on its own. And then we can also look at the partisans as individual actors, because even when SUBNOR ceases to be important and when the Socialist Alliance of Working People takes over, the partisans are still the main drivers, individual partisans, veterans, and they occupy also leading positions across different socio-political organizations, institutions, committees, and so on. And simply most often when a representative of any liberation movement had the first contact or ongoing cooperation, communication with someone from Yugoslavia about visits, about aid, about diplomatic matters, they usually had contact with partisans. This is to say in the simplest terms, meaning men and women who had direct experience of war and revolution themselves. And here, of course, one of the very important questions in my project is also how much this experience of war and revolution informed their activism and their decisions. But this is something that I can't really answer fully now, of course, at this stage of the project. So the first theme that I mentioned that's important in my project that I'm looking at are the narratives of the shared past. And this doesn't necessarily only surface in the context of Algeria, Angola, Mozambique, and so on, but in many other contexts. Yugoslav veterans saw the anti-colonial struggle as something comparable or similar to the People's Liberation War, simply. And they also saw that the liberation fighters were facing the same or similar challenges, and that they were also fighting for similar goals. So during the Algerian War, for example, if we look at documents and public speeches and so on, we can see that Yugoslav state officials, leaders of socio-political organizations, Red Cross representatives and so on, even various experts involved in the initiatives of solidarity, all referred to the Algerian struggle as very similar to the People's Liberation War. And many of these people were, of course, partisans themselves. And another level of this is really recognizing the similarity of difficulties and challenges that liberation movements faced, and also the meaning and necessity of assistance or solidarity in this context. And this was the driving motive for many of the Yugoslav veterans at the beginning of the Algerian War to advocate for helping the movement. And of course, this was not only the official narrative, it was also promoted across Yugoslav society, among other things, because there was a need also to justify spending so many resources helping the Algerian liberation movement. So we have films, exhibitions, books, newspapers, which all brought this Algerian struggle closer to the Yugoslav population. And very often, from the other side, these narratives were reciprocated. So when FLN representatives or fighters talk about Yugoslavia, they often also compared the two struggles as similar and or same. The second level that this project looks at, that I would like to address today, is the sharing of the Yugoslav war experience, but also post-war experience of building state socialism. And if we look at these few decades from the mid-50s to the 80s, we can see that liberation movements were generally interested in the experience of the People's Liberation War. And whether it is military training that was provided for them, or that would involve, for example, tactics or strategies, different aspects of guerrilla warfare or partisan warfare, and so on. But I would like to focus here particularly on, I think, neglected dimension of medicine. More concretely, first military or battlefield medicine, and then the post-war disability care for the veterans, as also the experience that was shared with different liberation movements. And in Algeria, this was very evident. And we can consider Yugoslav initiatives of helping Algeria as an example of socialist medical internationalism that always has, in different contexts throughout the Cold War, both immediate and long-term goals, as Dora Varga argues in her work on Hungary. So, for example, if we look at more concretely on disabled or wounded fighters, this would involve first the necessary care and rehabilitation, surgeries, maybe production of orthopedic and prosthetic devices and so on. But then on the other hand, there is always the dimension of creating some kind of long-term structures or contributing to the establishment and then also independent functioning of different spheres of medical rehabilitation, so like orthopedics, prosthetics, physiotherapy, and so on. And then if we look at the case of Yugoslavia and Algeria, this process developed from the already mentioned treatment of Algerian fighters in Yugoslavia, then to the opening of a center for rehabilitation in Tunisia that was serving only the FLN. And then finally, there was the support also for disability care in independent Algeria and the opening of the first national center for rehabilitation, for example, and also providing instruction in these and training in these fields at the university. First, as I said, we have these two levels. The first would be, in the case of Algeria, the treatment for the wounded fighters. And as I said already, almost 300 fighters were transported to Yugoslavia for necessary treatments, rehabilitation, and so on. And I argue that this initiative directly relates to the war experience and similarities between the conditions and challenges of the two struggles in Yugoslavia during the Second World War and then in Algeria in the 50s and 60s. And this is, of course, also, as I said, how everyone involved talks about it as well. And this is also very importantly about the symbolic dimension of the care for the wounded and later disability care that was very important in Yugoslavia, and the symbolism of wounded fighters and their place in the culture of war remembrance as well. And if we zoom in to Algeria, I won't go into details here. We can see that the FLN had difficulties particularly treating the wounded, transporting them to safe places. There was lack of staff, lack of medicines and equipment. French forces worked very hard on limiting access to medicines to the liberation movement. The number of doctors, if we look at statistics, was extremely low even before the war. But then after the independence in Algeria, most of them were French and they left, leaving hospitals empty and the universities as well. And healthcare, as we know from the work of Jennifer Johnston, was a key aspect of state building and legitimacy of liberation movements, particularly in Algeria, where the FLN also did not only want to take care of the combatants, but also try to prove itself as the only force existing in Algeria that could take care of people as well. So this initiative between 1959 and 1962 of providing treatment and rehabilitation in Yugoslavia involved first, obviously, transporting all these men to Yugoslavia, then transporting them around Yugoslavia to different institutes of rehabilitation, different spas and so on, where they were staying. Then they were getting accommodation, food, pocket money, clothes and shoes, cigarettes, cinema tickets, and so on. Then they were also, the idea at the beginning was that they would all stay in Yugoslavia a bit longer, learn Serbo-Croatian, and then also go through professional rehabilitation. That idea was abandoned after the first group because, I mean, obviously it wasn't very practical. And these people would then have to stay in Yugoslavia for years. So they would go through different medical treatments. They would get orthopedic and prosthetic aids fitted to them. They would go through physiotherapy and so on. And this was obviously a very, very expensive initiative. So because of that, and not only because of the desire to create long-term structures, but also because this was very, very complicated and involved many different Yugoslav actors, the idea came to redirect funding to enable medical treatment in Tunisia rather than transporting all these people to Yugoslavia, and also then to create some kind of permanent structure that can serve the liberation movement even after the war. This Center for Rehabilitation in Tunisia opened in 1961. It had Yugoslav funding and equipment. It had a joint Yugoslav-Algerian team working there, where the Yugoslavs would then slowly withdraw after a few years. And it was also a training ground for medical workers of different kinds. And the center had infrastructure for medical and professional rehabilitation, but it also had library, different kinds of sports, physiotherapy, work therapy, equipment, space, and it also had, very importantly, a bit later, a prosthetic workshop that could also provide training for prosthetic technicians. And this was imagined as the institute that had the most modern methods and as the first such place in Africa, and it was always described like that by the Yugoslav actors. And this is important to mention because, of course, and we see that later with other liberation movements, that there was a very important propaganda value of these places, that something concrete, some kind of building, even if small, a hospital, a school or something like that was very important, because that's something on which you can put a plaque saying the Yugoslav hospital or the Yugoslav school, and this was visible aid, because if we compare Yugoslavia to the Soviet Union and to Cuba when it comes to medical assistance especially, of course, it was much lower, and it is today much less remembered in many of these countries, or even forgotten completely, because it was comparably much less. But on the other hand, if we look at the size and possibilities of Yugoslavia in generally, in comparison to these other countries, it was, of course, quite considerable effort for the Yugoslav socialist state. So this center was later dismantled and moved to Algeria after independence, with a lot of complications surrounding it, and it was even lost at some point, and everyone was looking for it, and so on. And eventually this initiative led to the establishment of the first center for rehabilitation in Algeria, near Algiers, that still exists today. But I will now go back a bit to Yugoslavia and the broader context for a little bit, rather than going into details about this center in Algeria. So why rehabilitation and disability care at all as topics here? They were very important internationally in the 50s. The UN and the World Health Organization very strongly focused on it, and veterans internationalism is almost only about rehabilitation and disability care in the 50s. And in Yugoslavia, as most of you know, or all of you know, thousands of disabled partisans pushed the state also to create different institutional and legal frameworks of disability care and protection, including these structures of medical and professional rehabilitation that would then be exported to Algeria. But if we then zoom into the situation in Yugoslavia in this period, it is very interesting that Yugoslavia invests in this in another country when it itself faces difficulties. The whole field is developing very slowly. There are a lot of problems. And Yugoslavia actually received UN support to establish the field and practice of rehabilitation and disability care. So, for example, the Federal Institute of Rehabilitation, where most of Algerian fighters were treated, opened only 2 years before the first group of Algerian fighters arrived. So this is not, we are not talking about the field and practice that was already very developed, where Yugoslavia had the leading experts in the field and was just helping another country establish it. So Yugoslavia is just few years ahead as opposed to Algeria, and that's really interesting. And Miroslav Zotović, who basically established the field of rehabilitation in Yugoslavia, he also worked in Tunisia, gave talks there at the Center for Rehabilitation, went to the first study visit to estimate and evaluate the situation, how many fighters there are, what's needed, and so on. So that was also interesting. And of course, as the Algerian Mujahideen established a veteran association later after independence, and the ministry in charge of it, they actually come back and consult SUBNOR about matters related to, for example, how to organize veteran protection, how to organize disability care, from, for example, what the laws are supposed to look like, to some practical aspects. But I will now move away from medicine. I don't know how much time I have. I have time. And look at the third promised topic for today that briefly. So the third theme that this project looks at, and that's the transfers of knowledge in war commemoration, actually. And I will here talk again about Yugoslavia and Algeria, just not to complicate it further. If we look at Yugoslavia and Algeria, the People's Liberation War or the War of Independence were the foundational events for both states and their regimes. And in both countries, the veterans took the central place and role in society, in politics, and also in the culture of remembrance. And while veterans from Yugoslavia and Algeria had actually close contacts and exchanged visits and so on from the late 50s already, like before they were veterans in the case of Algeria, it was only in the early 70s that cooperation in the sphere of war remembrance comes up. And that's simply because it coincided with the newly awakened interest of Algerian veterans for memory work and the realization of the Algerian state that war veterans should be responsible for culture of memory. So the exchange of experiences then in war commemoration surfaced in the early 70s, and they were formalized through a series of different interstate cultural cooperation agreements between Yugoslavia and Algeria, where veterans advocated to include a section on veterans, documentation, and memory in the official agreements. And here, in these cultural agreements between Yugoslavia and Algeria, if we zoom into this veteran section on veterans, memory, and documentation, we can find different plans, such as exchanges of experts, exchanges in the fields of public history, cooperation of archives, twinning of archives and museums of revolution, museology, research, and also the Algerian veterans really actively requested support and training in this sphere from Subnor. And there was one study visit, for example, where they came and where they came to learn about the Yugoslav memory culture, and they, with the list of requests, what they want to see, what they want to talk about, and so on. So they visited museums, historical institutes, different architects and sculptors, for example, who were working on some large-scale war memorials. And they also, interestingly, wanted to explore the practices of archiving, on how to do historical research projects, which I find really interesting as well, how to preserve important war objects, for example, and how different institutions of memory and history worked. And they were just like really taken to all these different places. One of them was an architect, so he just wanted to talk about memorials, for example, and so on. And this is really a good example also. It is not only interesting because you can see that it's not only the traveling of discourses and narratives that happens, but we also have very concrete cooperation in the field of culture of war remembrance. But it is also a good example on why we really can't rely only on Yugoslav sources. Because I can't tell you anything about the outcomes of these visits and these cultural cooperation agreements without looking at Algerian archives, and that's what I'm going to do hopefully later this year. So I think I will slowly conclude here. I hope that I have managed to provide a good overview, because I'm somewhere in the middle where I'm almost done with the Yugoslav archives, but I still haven't done research in any other countries that are case studies, so it was a bit also complicated how to frame it and represent different aspects of the project. This is the project website if you want to, if you haven't heard enough about it today. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jelena. This was a wonderful lecture. And now, please, the floor is yours for questions, comments, here in the meeting room, in virtual space as well. Anyone? Jida?
Maybe if I can take two questions? Possible, okay. Yeah, maybe the first one, you mentioned the military trainings. And I know this is not the basic thing of your research here, but you maybe know. One thing is military training that happened in Yugoslavia. But the other thing that happened was the military training that happened in the field, on the ground in Algeria. And this was probably a delicate issue. How do you maybe have any idea how many training personnel, the Yugoslav training personnel was present there, how they were maybe even presented, were they undercover per se? And the second question is regarding the presentation office in Belgrade, Bureau, I don't know how it was called. As far as I know, this was the first one, the first Liberation Movement Bureau in Belgrade. And if you monitor the activity of the Bureau, especially in the matter of propaganda of the revolution on the ground of Yugoslavia, how much were they involved in these collaborations during the revolution? They opened later? Or
who was involved? Sorry.
How much the Algerian Bureau in Belgrade was involved, in these collaborations?
I will answer that second question first. They were not really involved. You can see, I think that's also the case later with MPLA Information Center in Belgrade, that when the fund for helping victims of colonialism and so on, or the Committee for Helping Algeria, when they have meetings or anything, they don't invite representatives who live in Belgrade. I always found it a bit peculiar that there is actually a representative. For those of you who maybe don't know, some liberation movements had information centers in Belgrade, and also Yugoslav organizations and institutions took over printing also of a lot of different newspapers and other materials for these movements, and the Algerian was the first, and the representative was sometimes at some, if a delegation from Algeria was coming, the representative from Belgrade was also there, but not involved in the collaboration or decision making in any way. I don't know if in the case of PLO, if that stays the same, but in the case of Algeria and Angola, at least, this is not the case at all. That anyone asked them or invited them, asked them for opinion, which is really interesting. So all requests for assistance came directly from the representatives, from the leadership of the liberation movement from the particular country, and not from the office in Belgrade. I didn't read anything about the military training that took place in Algeria, actually. From documents that I looked at, there is nothing about it. I still have to go to the military archives, though.
Okay, please.
I find it hard to believe that so many resources are mobilized merely out of a sense of sympathy or solidarity. You repeatedly show this quotation from your Algerian fighter says, "Oh, we see in the Yugoslav struggle our own model for our own struggle," which is, perfectly understandable as a polite thing to say, but I find it hard to believe that's their actual emotion. It's obvious that Algerian fighters are keen to get overseas support where they can get it. If they can get it from Yugoslavia, terrific. But what is the state motive? What is the self-interested motive on the Yugoslav side? What is Tito hoping to accomplish with this?
There are, obviously there are multiple motives behind any of these initiatives of solidarity, but I would not deny that there was also, at least from the Yugoslav side, really deep personal identification with the Algerian struggle. The Algerian war started only 9 years after the Second World War ended in Yugoslavia. The Second World War, the People's Liberation War, was still very fresh in people's memory, and these people were also at the positions in power.
You gave evidence that their Yugoslav veterans were not being cared for. And I find it hard to believe that Yugoslav authorities see in the Algerians something more key to their own struggle than they do in the actual Yugoslav veterans who are in position of need. So for them to say, we're not going to prioritize our own Yugoslav veterans, we prefer to prioritize these Algerians and their struggle, there has to be something more than a feeling of sympathy. There has to be some foreign policy goal.
Of course, but I wouldn't, I just said that I wouldn't deny the solidarity that was based on the idea of common struggle. But I didn't say that, maybe I wasn't clear, I didn't say that the Yugoslav state did not take care of its own veterans. I was just trying to explain that Yugoslavia was only a few years ahead when it comes to Algeria, that all these practices and mechanisms of disability care were only developing for a few years when they started helping the Algerian fighters. In the meetings, these different representatives of different organizations and institutions always actually talk about it and always emphasize that it is important that the Algerian wounded and disabled fighters do not receive anything more than what an average Yugoslav war veteran would have rights to. So this is always very important because all these initiatives were constantly in media and were known to veterans, of course. When it comes to motives, from the Yugoslav side, this is why I think a long-term perspective looking at Algeria as a pattern in a way, and then looking at later developments can also tell us how not only motives but narratives of solidarity change. So the narratives of the shared struggle, of the common struggle, of we have all been fighting the same fight, almost disappears later, already in the 70s, and is replaced rather by non-alignment as the more important narrative, where, at least in the case of the former Portuguese colonies, where Yugoslav officials always talk about them as having non-aligned leanings and having the same worldview as Yugoslavia, in the sense of like once these countries become independent, they will be non-aligned and cooperate with Yugoslavia. But of course, if we want to look at medical internationalism in a long-term perspective, what happens later is that this medical assistance is for free, of course. It is Yugoslavia finances it, of course, but then later we see the monetization of healthcare from Yugoslavia into the global south. I think Ljubljana is also a great location to talk about it, because Peter Wright works on this particularly, that state leaders from across the global south would come to Ljubljana to get treated, to get surgeries and so on, and they would pay for it. And also Yugoslav doctors who worked in these different countries as experts of technical cooperation, they would also get paid. So only during the liberation war it is when it's really assistance to the liberation struggle. Later it turns into technical cooperation, and then there is obviously economic interest for both sides. I hope I managed to answer your question.
More questions? There is one question on Zoom. Just a moment that I open it. It's from Jelena Đureinović. Hi, I have a question regarding the medical internationalism and its applications in post-colonial settings. I was wondering if next to direct medical aid, psychiatric and physical, Yugoslavia also supported fundamental scientific research institutions, potentially interesting for the prevalence of post-war cybernetics and its applications. Thanks.
I don't know anything about that. About a specific field, no. But I think, there separately from, there was scientific, technical and educational cooperation happening between Yugoslavia and different countries, independent, post-colonial countries. I'm not looking at that, but there was scientific exchange beyond the student scholarships, of course. But when it comes to that particular field, I think, no. I'm not, I think, expert for that to answer it.
Okay. Anyone else? Marko, please.
I have a slightly dull question regarding Yugoslav. You mentioned that this kind of that this support will usually in Subnor organized, then went to the Alliance of Working People, Socialist Alliance of Working People. Did anything change in this process? What did that mean and so on? Because that's all my dear colleagues in the very well known part of our program. Interest is also the Working Alliance of Working People per se as an organization from various points of view. So I think I find this very interesting also. You can elaborate slightly about that.
Yeah, I didn't want to go into details during the presentation because it would be maybe not interesting for everyone, but yeah. Did you want to say something else?
No, it's okay.
I think I wasn't maybe clear. Subnor was, because I'm using Subnor as a lens, Subnor was, had its own direct bilateral exchanges with first liberation movements, then their veteran associations later. And Subnor was the first attempt to organize Yugoslav solidarity efforts, was this committee for helping Algeria, where Subnor was a member. And the only other socio-political organization there were the trade unions. Then, in 1969, the Socialist Alliance of Working People of Yugoslavia organizes the Fund for Helping Victims of Colonial Domination, which is supposed to gather representatives of socio-political and social organizations that are members of the alliance, and the main task is helping liberation movements. And it has its own budget, as opposed to the Committee for Helping Algeria that didn't have budget, but the the government would just transfer some funds or pay something directly for. The committee was just deciding who and how to help. And the fund within the Alliance of Working People was created with its own budget, and that was supposed to, like, if any organization gets a request from a liberation movement, they were supposed to forward it here. And that right away at the beginning created a mess, because there were, of course, then the youth comes and says, oh, we want to go and participate at these conferences. That's also important. And many things get funded that has nothing to do with liberation movements. But also, what I find particularly interesting is their discussion on, like, what is solidarity, because conference participation is not, or what else is. What is anti-colonial liberation movement, who is a victim of colonial domination, and so on. And this fund then takes over. And here, throughout the 70s, we can see Subnor really, if you look at meeting reports from the fund, usually it has lists of representatives of organization, and for Subnor, the person is usually not there. So they really don't participate so much anymore. But then on the other hand, in the governing board of this fund, throughout its existence, either really everyone at the beginning and later almost everyone was a partisan. But Subnor as an organization wasn't really active anymore, which is really interesting, because during the war in Algeria, Subnor also managed to gather some funds to also use their own funds for certain initiatives, such as training of some physiotherapists or something like that, and then later they just withdraw as an organization.
Thank you. Much more interesting
This is one of, I should probably add, one of the aspects of my work is really zooming in on socio-political organizations and Alliance of Working People, as because I think it's also a good lens to map these both discourses and actors of anti-colonial solidarity in Yugoslavia, and how these discourses change, and how these notions of solidarity and anti-colonialism are debated.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. I have two questions. One is, so I was very interested about, again, this sort of justification, or like how they were trying to bring together or close the liberation movement in Algeria. And I remember I read in some magazines, journals, not Praxis, Naše Teme, for example, they had these very specific, almost special editions about different countries. I think there is also Algeria, but also others. So there was kind of like learning about these countries, the faraway countries. So I was wondering what are maybe other ways in which they were kind of bringing this experience closer, next to this, of course, as you nicely explained, these kind of connections with the Yugoslav liberation war. And another question, I was very interested about the rehabilitation that you were talking about, and these centers, disability and rehabilitation, and I was wondering what sort of, I mean, maybe this is too, like, kind of stretched too far, but I was wondering whether there are any sort of, like, this kind of traumatic experiences of being in a war, not only physical in the sense like losing leg and so, but also psychological, because around this time there are a lot of also journals about psychology and kind of interest in psychology and mind. So actually, can I have another one as well? If you have maybe time, just to reflect more about the archive. I find it very interesting that you were saying about this archive, and kind of learning how to kind of getting this technique of how to organize the knowledge. Because also when you take like on a kind of let's say very general level, the idea of an archive is also very European kind of understanding, like categorizing and so on. So just a reflection, I was just wondering, but that's a side note, sorry. Thank you.
There were different ways of popularizing the Algerian struggle, but later also other liberation movements in Yugoslavia. So, for example, films, exhibitions, photo exhibitions, books of translated poetry, or football team touring Yugoslavia, and that Dora Tot wrote about, and so on. So there were different initiatives that would bring the Algerian struggle closer to the people of Yugoslavia. And also, I couldn't really trace that a bit further than that. I didn't find anything in the newspapers when Amilcar Cabral from Guinea-Bissau, from PAIGC, was in Yugoslavia. One of the times he was in Yugoslavia, he was supposed to go around Yugoslavia and give public talks about the struggle of the people of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. So there were always these ideas. I was always wondering, like, from some most practical level, like what language is it all going to be about? Is there going to be a translator? What is that going to look like? To who would come to these events and so on. So there were always these ideas to popularize it in a way, to use visits, for example, for some kind of talks or events and so on. And and of course, travel logs and memoirs. In the case of Algeria, we have, there was a phaeton it was being published in the Subnor newspaper, but I think it was also in some daily newspaper that was then later turned into a book by Milutin Milenković, who spent time with the Algerian fighters and who just wrote this series of texts for Yugoslav press that was then compiled and published already before, I think, the war in Algeria ended. And of course, Zdravko Pečar and his book that was published later about the history of the liberation struggle and so on. And of course, students. I wouldn't go into details because I'm not really studying that, but there were many students from these countries who were also in Yugoslavia and kind of created further contacts that were not state sanctioned. Psychological rehabilitation is not a topic, and it is really, it is not a topic also for the Yugoslav partisans yet. No one talks about war trauma. And Zotović, who I already mentioned, in his publications from the mid-50s and early 60s, when he talks about the establishment of rehabilitation practice in Yugoslavia, he always mentioned that, like, people had to be treated and rehabilitated both physically and psychologically, but in practice he didn't do that. His institute didn't do that. The Algerian fighters also didn't receive any kind of psychological support. When Red Cross representatives are all and officials are all shocked that these people are behaving in a certain way or drinking and getting into fights with each other and being violent and so on, no one even thinks for a second about the context that they are coming from and that they could be also affected by the war, not only in physical terms. So but this is the case also with the Yugoslav veterans at that time, that trauma is simply not a topic. Archive, I think why they were asking about archives could be also because when the French authorities were withdrawing, they also took archives. So that would be one of the basic reasons why there was no professional staff, there was no archive left, and there was obviously a need to create it. So but I find it really interesting that they really like come with this list that has historical research, archives, documentation, preserving objects, and then also like broadly memorials, commemorations, how to get young people interested, which, as you all probably know, was Subnor's very important hobby starting from the 70s, where they really turned towards the youth. And then the Algerian fighters also asked them, how do you do this? How to go to schools and get kids interested? Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one last question or two last questions, if you're sure. Anyone else? Otherwise, I have one question, and it's a bit more broad maybe. It's about these competing socialist interventions to Algerian War of Independence. You mentioned that Yugoslav engagement got a bit forgotten if I understood correctly. So I was just wondering, you know, in what way help from Soviet Union or from China or from anywhere else was coming, and if you know, perhaps, I know this is not your field, maybe just if you were doing some comparative reading or anything, and how they were framing, you know, this solidarity with different countries, because with Yugoslavia, obviously there was a very similar foundational moment. Well, I don't know, maybe with China it was as well. What about the Soviet Union or any other countries that were sending some kind of help, and how it was remembered afterwards?
Well, I think when it comes to the perception of the Yugoslav assistance in the post-colonial settings today, this is most obvious in the former Portuguese colonies, so Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique, where, from our perspective as researchers, there's a few of us working on this, and it is a relevant topic from the Yugoslav perspective, but it's not necessarily equally relevant from the other side. And this is, again, another reason why, without also consulting the archives of these countries and also researchers who work from their perspective, this is not a full picture. So, for example, in Guinea-Bissau, I gave a very similar talk like today, and there was, for example, one person who was asking about, well, why didn't Yugoslavia do more when even Sweden did this, and the Soviet Union did this and that, and so on, because the Yugoslav assistance was not as significant for them, because they received more arms from the Soviet Union or Cuba that are exhibited in the Military History Museum. You won't see Yugoslav arms exhibited there because it is much less significant. And when it comes to the competing interventions, I think what must be always mentioned is, and when it comes to these hospitals and these concrete visible forms of assistance, is that there was always certain competition between these different countries, and in the field as well. In Guinea, so in the Republic of Guinea, there was the Yugoslav Solidarity Hospital for the liberation movements of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, and that was stationed in the same place where there was also a Cuban team working, and they got into all sorts of conflicts. After 1968, there was a huge conflict between the two surgeons who were leading the team, and then the Yugoslav surgeon went to the Yugoslav embassy in Conakry, and they went to see the leader of the liberation movement, so we are talking about the middle of the war, to Amilcar Cabral, to complain that the Cuban team is making fun of Yugoslav style of socialism and of Tito and so on. And I mean, for Cabral, this was, he managed to kind of send them away, and it didn't turn into some kind of incident, but there was a competition always, and there was they were counting how many patients who was able to treat, how many beds does the other hospital have, and so on. And there was always the idea that like a concrete house-like structure is very important because it's visible, and you can really put a tag on it saying the Yugoslav hospital. Yeah, and then even when the same Yugoslav hospital was supposed to be renovated because it was half eaten by termites, and because it was one of these prefabricated houses from Energo Project, actually, so it wasn't really a building, and it was damaged from the rain season, from termites, as I said, and all sorts of things. And when it was supposed to be reconstructed, Sweden was going to offer funding for it, and then there were these discussions in Yugoslav organizations and institutions how to avoid it, because then it wouldn't be on a Yugoslav hospital. So I think this is always part of it, of course, and of course that everyone always looks at it, how many doctors the other states sent, and how many did we manage to send, and if we can't send more, can we do something else, like build a hospital and so on. But the center in Algeria, in Tunisia, that wasn't the same kind, like the one in Guinea. I must mention that the one in Guinea was just prefabricated containers from Energo Project that were repurposed
Thank you. Any more comments? Otherwise, we can continue over the cup of coffee, which is today downstairs. Thank you very much for attending, and once again, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you for having me.